Okay, picture this. An AI system isn't just doing a task, it's actively evaluating another AI's performance.
Right.
And not just giving a thumbs up or down, but actually showing its work, thinking step by step, like a really meticulous judge.
It sounds futuristic, maybe, but teaching AI to evaluate other AI and critically doing it by thinking, well, that's absolutely essential for making the AI we all use get better, more reliable.
Yeah, seems foundational almost.
Precisely. And today we are going to plunge into a really fascinating recent piece of research tackling this head on. We're looking at a paper titled J1 Incentivizing Thinking in LLM as a Judge via Reinforcement Learning.
This is research out of Meta. And what they're presenting here is essentially a novel recipe, you could say, for training large language models, LLMs, to become much better, more robust evaluators.
Yeah, a recipe is a good way to put it. Our goal in this deep dive is really to unpack the technical heart of J1. How does it specifically use reinforcement learning, RL, to not just get the right verdict, but to actively encourage and shape that thinking
The
process?
chain of thought reasoning, right?
Exactly, the chain of thought or COTI within these AI judges, making their evaluations more dependable.
So, okay, let's ground this first. Why is building better AI judges even considered such a bottleneck? The paper starts pretty strongly on this.
It does, yeah. It literally says the progress of AI is bottlenecked by the quality of evaluation. And if you think about it, it makes sense. If we can't accurately and consistently measure how well an AI performs on all sorts of tasks.
Like coding or creative writing or just chatting.
Right, exactly. All these diverse things, if we can't measure that well, we can't effectively train them, compare them, or, improve them. Evaluation is that critical feedback loop.
Right. If you can't score the test properly, you don't know if your studying, your training is actually working.
Couldn't have said it better. And evaluation methods have definitely evolved. Traditionally, and the paper points this out, reward models might just spit out a single score.
Like a 7 out of 10, end of story.
Yeah, just a number, not very helpful for understanding why it got that score or how to fix things. Right. Then came the rise of this LLM as a judge idea, often starting with clever prompting techniques.
Okay?
And that was a big step because using these capable LLMs as the evaluators open the door to generating detailed reasoning before giving a verdict. That's the chain of thought.
Showing your work, step-by-step reasoning.
Yes, and the paper's really clear on this point. Improved judgment ability is enabled by stronger chain of thought reasoning. The quality, the depth of that internal thinking process, it's directly linked to how good the final judgment actually is.
You need the why behind the what.
Precisely.
Okay, so the goal isn't just a correct answer, but a correct answer arrived at through solid reasoning. And this is where J1 comes in with its core innovation.
Yes, exactly. J1 is presented as this new recipe for building judges, and the key ingredient is using reinforcement learning, RL, specifically to incentivize this COTI thinking process itself.
Okay, that's interesting. We usually hear about RL for like game playing or robotics, learning actions to get a final reward. How does that work for teaching an LLM to think and judge? How do you reward the thinking?
That's the crux of the innovation, really. Instead of just training the model to predict a score or a preference based on, say, human labels, J1's RL setup gives rewards that depend not just on the final verdict being right,
Uh-huh.
but also implicitly on the process leading to it. They're shaping the model's policy, its whole way of generating tokens, including those COTI tokens, to maximize rewards tied to judgment quality and, importantly, consistency.
And they use a specific RL method.
Yeah, they use something called Group Relative Policy Optimization, or GRPO. The paper highlights it as being efficient because it estimates the baseline reward from group scores, which means they don't need to train a whole separate critic model. Keeps things simpler.
So it's RL fine-tuning the entire generation process, the reasoning steps, and the final decision, not just tweaking the last layer.
That's it, exactly. They're training the policy to produce token sequences that include good COTI because that sequence as a whole leads to higher rewards in the judgment task.
And that's different from older methods, like DPO.
It is different, yeah. Some prior work might use RL just for the final decision or rely on other fine-tuning like DPO direct preference optimization. DPO usually aligns a model with preferences, but doesn't necessarily, explicitly reward generating the intermediate reasoning steps in the same way. J1 brings RL right into shaping the thinking aspect of judging.
Okay, that makes sense. But RL needs a reward signal. And you mentioned judging subjective things like chats. How do you get a reliable, verifiable reward signal for something subjective during training? That seems like a huge challenge.
It absolutely is, and that's where J1 introduces another really clever technique, generating synthetic training data in a specific way, a way that creates verifiable judgment tasks even for those non-verifiable prompts.
How does that work? If it's a chat, like you said, there's no single objective best response.
Right, they don't try to define the absolute best. Instead, for every prompt, whether it's from a verifiable domain like math problems or non-verifiable like user chats from the wild chat dataset, they synthetically generate two responses.
Okay.
One they designate as high quality and one as low quality.
Okay. And how do they make one high and one low quality synthetically? Do they use another AI or specific prompts?
Yeah, the paper mentions different ways like conditioning generation on specific criteria, helpfulness, honesty, harmlessness, or just prompting a strong model to explicitly generate a good and a bad version for the same input. The key point is they control which one is designated good and bad in the generated pair.
Gotcha.
So this creates a verifiable pairwise judgment task. Is response A better than response B? Since they know by design that A was the high quality one and B was low quality, the correct judgment is knowable, verifiable for training.
Okay. So the verifiable reward for the RL training comes from the AI judge correctly picking out the synthetically designated high quality response in that pair.
Exactly. And this is a brilliant step because it bypasses the huge cost and the inherent subjectivity of needing human annotators to label millions and millions of preference pairs for every possible task.
Yeah, that sounds incredibly expensive and slow.
Totally. As the source puts it, this approach removes the reliance on human annotated preference pairs since it can be costly to obtain. It's a much more scalable way to get ground truth for this kind of training.
That really is a significant technical contribution in itself, making verifiable training data out of thin air almost for subjective domains.
It really is. And with that verifiable ground truth from the synthetic pairs, they can then define the specific reward signals for the RL agent. They use a rule-based system primarily with two types of rewards.
The first one sounds pretty straightforward.
Yes, the first is the verdict correctness reward. Simple. If the AI judge's final verdict on a synthetic pair matches the ground truth, picks the high quality one, it gets a reward of 1, if not 0. Just basic accuracy incentive.
Makes sense. Get it right, get a point. But there was another one. You mentioned consistency earlier.
Right. The second one is the crucial and novel one, the verdict consistency reward. This one specifically targets that well-known problem in LLM judges, position bias.
Position bias. I've heard about this, where just the order you show the responses in can sway the judge's decision. Like putting the better one first gives it an unfair edge.
Exactly. The paper calls it a phenomenon, and it can seriously undermine how reliable an AI judge is if it just prefers the first answer it sees.
Then it's not really judging the content.
Precisely. And the consistency reward directly penalizes this. A reward of 1 for consistency is given only if the model gets the judgment right for both possible input orders of the exact same response pair.
Wait, hang on. So if it sees response A, response B, and correctly says A is better,
Uh-huh.
it also has to see response B, response A later on, and still correctly say A is better to get that consistency point.
That's exactly right. If swapping A and B makes it flip its verdict, that consistency reward is 0. Even if one of the verdicts, in isolation, was technically correct based on the ground truth for that order.
Wow. Okay.
It forces the model through the RL process to learn to base its judgment purely on the content of A and B, not on whether A came first or second. It's a very direct way to train against that bias.
That's a really smart use of the reward signal to target a specific known flaw. Did they do anything else to tackle position bias?
They did. Besides that explicit reward, they also structure the training data itself. They make sure to include both orderings of the synthetic pairs, so prompt A, B, and also prompt B, A, and they process these in what they call position-agnostic batches.
Meaning the model sees both orderings close together during training within the same batch.
Yes. So that structure, combined with the consistency reward, makes it really hard for the model to find and rely on any simple positional cues. It's like a multi-pronged attack on this bias problem.
Okay, really hitting it from multiple angles. Now, beyond how it learns and gets rewarded, the paper also looks at different formats for the judge's output, right? Pairwise J1 and pointwise J1. Can you break down that difference? Why look at both?
Certainly. So pairwise J1 is the main type we've mostly discussed. It takes two responses, A and B, generates its chain of thought, and then outputs a verdict. That verdict could be a simple choice, like literally outputting A or B, Or it could be actual scores for both, like SA and SB.
So it directly compares the two, like how a human might evaluate options side by side.
Exactly. It mimics that direct comparison process.
And the pointwise J1?
The pointwise J1 is structurally quite different. It takes the instruction prompt and only one response as input. Then it outputs its thinking, its QOT, and a score, usually on a scale like 0-10 for that single response in isolation. It never sees A and B together for a direct comparison.
Okay, so it's evaluated each response on its own merits. And I guess by definition, if it only ever sees one response at a time, there's no order for it to be biased by.
Exactly. As the paper notes, it is by design position consistent. That inherent consistency is a huge potential advantage. But it raises a question. How do you train a model to give a reliable single score when your main training data is all pairwise preferences, A is better than B?
Yeah, it seems like another tricky technical bit. How do you get those pointwise scores from pairwise comparisons without needing a whole new data set of humans giving individual 0-10 scores, which sounds just as hard as the prescience labels?
Right, and this is another novel technical contribution they present. They train the pointwise J1 model using something called distance supervision, and they derive the supervision signal from the same pairwise synthetic data they used for the pairwise model.
Distance supervision. Okay, that means using a related signal, but not an exact label to guide the training.
Basically, yes, they take each known pairwise preference from their synthetic data, where A is designated better than B. They then split this into two separate examples for the pointwise model's training.
Ah, okay.
The pointwise model sees response A alone and gives it a score. Then it sees response B alone and gives it a score. It gets a reward during training if the scores it assigns are consistent with the original pairwise preference, meaning the score it gives A should be higher than the score it gives B.
I see. So it learns to assign absolute scores to individual responses in such a way that if you were to compare those scores later, they would correctly rank the responses according to the original pairwise ground truth.
Precisely. It's a very clever technique. It lets them leverage all that readily available pairwise data to train a model that operates in this fundamentally different, inherently more consistent pointwise way without needing expensive, separate pointwise human labels. That's a key innovation here.
That's really neat. And when they compared the characteristics of these pairwise versus pointwise models in practice, what did they find?
They found some interesting differences. The pairwise J1 models, particularly the one trained to output scores, they call this PAS, tended to produce sparser score distributions.
Meaning bigger gaps between good and bad scores.
Yeah, you see larger score differences between the preferred and the rejected responses, which kind of makes sense, right? They're trained on that direct contrast, ABSB.
Okay. And the pointwise J1?
The pointwise J1 models, trained with that distant supervision method, had a smoother score distribution overall, but crucially, they demonstrated superior positional consistency. They had significantly fewer ties situations where two different responses end up getting the exact same score compared to the rate of inconsistency you still see in the pairwise J1 models, even with all the bias mitigation, when you specifically test them by swapping the order.
So the pointwise model, trained this novel way, really delivered on that promise of consistency.
It did, yeah. On metrics that strictly measure position-consistent accuracy, the pointwise J1 often showed superior performance.
It's fascinating how the architecture and the specific training approach really shape the model's behavior and strengths. You mentioned the chain of thought earlier. What kind of things do these J1 models actually learn to think about? What do those reasoning patterns look like in the output?
Yeah, they analyzed the CAST tokens the models generated and found they learned what the researchers call sophisticated thinking patterns. It's good evidence that the RL isn't just optimizing for the final answer, but is genuinely encouraging useful, structured reasoning.
Like what kind of structures? Can you give examples?
Sure, the learned patterns included things like explicitly outlining the criteria they plan to use for the evaluation before they start, sometimes even generating their own reference answer to compare the candidate responses against.
Wow, okay.
Also reevaluating earlier steps in their own reasoning, sort of double checking themselves, and providing really detailed comparisons between the responses, especially in the pairwise models, point by point.
So it's not just repeating the prompt, it's actually breaking down the task and assessing things systematically.
Exactly. It shows a process, not just a conclusion.
Okay, but the real test, the proof is in the pudding, right? Performance on benchmarks. How did J1 actually do when they tested it against others?
Right. J1 models, both the 8 billion and the larger 70 billion parameter versions, achieved really strong performance across a whole suite of benchmarks. These tests cover various aspects of evaluation: subjective preferences, factual accuracy, robustness to bias, following complex instructions, things like PPE, judge bench, RM bench, follow bench of all, reward bench, a lot of them.
And the results suggest this novel RL approach, focusing on thinking, is actually paying off.
Absolutely. J1 showed some pretty impressive outperformance. For instance, it managed to outperform models that were trained on significantly more data, like one called DeepSeek GRM.
Wow.
And it also beat models that were distilled from much, much larger models like DeepSeek R1 distilled llama, even though those distilled models might inherit knowledge from a giant parent model.
So the specific way J1 is trained seems to be giving it a real edge, even against models using brute force data or starting from a huge distilled base.
That seems to be the key takeaway, yeah. The training methodology itself is crucial, and maybe one of the most interesting findings. While a truly massive model like DeepSeek R1, which is like 671 billion parameter,
Truth.
was still better on some purely verifiable tasks like math, the J1 models actually outperformed this giant on the more subjective, non-verifiable tasks, things like the chat hard and safety categories within reward bench.
That's a really powerful result. Outperforming a model almost 10 times its size on complex subjective judgment. That suggests J1 is becoming a seriously capable generalist judge.
It really does point that way. And they also showed that standard techniques applied at test time, like self-consistency,
Where you run it multiple times and take a majority vote?
kind of, yeah. You generate multiple chains of thought, multiple reasoning path, and aggregate the results. They used SC at 32, meaning 32 samples. Doing that further boosted performance and consistency for both the pairwise and pointwise J1 models. It suggests the underlying reasoning it learned is solid enough to benefit from more compute at inference time.
Nice. Did the paper offer any other interesting nuggets from, like, ablation studies, where they tweaked parts of the setup?
Yeah, they did some analysis to understand what parts of their recipe were most important. For the reward schemes, they found something a better intuitive, at least for the pairwise J1. The simplest strategy seemed best, only giving positive rewards for correct verdicts.
So no penalties for wrong answers, no extra rewards for good formatting.
Exactly. Trying to add negative rewards for incorrect answers or specific rewards just for using the thinking tags, think correctly, didn't seem to help and sometimes even slightly hurt performance in their setup.
Huh. Keep it simple, maybe.
That seems to be the finding here. They also tested different initial seed prompts to get the model to start thinking. They compared their simple thinking prompt to something more complex, like plan and execute, which you might see in other reasoning frameworks.
Did the fancier prompt lead to better thinking?
Performance was actually pretty similar across the different prompts, but interestingly, the simpler thinking prompt actually led to richer, more detailed reasoning traces in the K-out-T output.
Really?
Yeah, those explicit criteria, the reference answers, the detail comparisons, those seem to show up more often with just the simple prompt. It suggests sometimes a less prescriptive instruction can actually unlock more complex and beneficial learned behaviors during RL training.
Fascinating. Okay, we've really dug into the mechanics here. The RL focus on thinking, the synthetic data magic, the clever rewards, tackling bias, the different judge types, and those impressive benchmark results. Let's zoom out now. What does all this technical detail actually mean for you, the listener? Why should you care about this kind of research into AI judging other AI?
Well, fundamentally, this kind of research is building a foundation for the next generation of AI that you interact with every day. Every chatbot you use, every AI coding assistant, every summarization tool, its quality is directly linked back to how effectively it was evaluated and trained during its development.
Right. So if the AI systems that are judging the models being built are more reliable, more transparent because they actually show their thinking, and more robust, less biased, then the models you end up using will just inherently get better.
That's the connection, exactly. J1's technical innovations using RL to explicitly teach thinking, creating scalable, verifiable data synthetically, specifically training against bias with novel rewards and data structures, and successfully training that highly consistent pointwise judge from pairwise data, these are all pushing the boundaries of AI evaluation.
So this work is helping build the critical infrastructure needed for more capable, more trustworthy AI.
Yes, precisely. It's contributing to making AI systems more useful, more reliable for everyone by improving how we measure and guide their development.
This has been a really dense, but I think incredibly rewarding deep dive into how researchers are tackling this fundamental problem of AI evaluation by essentially teaching models to think like expert judges.
Yeah, J1 really offers a powerful new recipe. It shows RL can be highly effective for training AI judges to generate that valuable, structured chain of thought reasoning. The synthetic data approach makes it scalable, and the methods for tackling position bias, especially that novel training for the inherently consistent pointwise J1 model, are really significant steps forward.
And it kind of leaves you thinking, doesn't it? If AI can be taught through these structured training methods and clever reward signals to generate explicit reasoning processes and evaluate the quality of its peers so systematically, what does that really imply about the potential for AI to truly understand concepts like quality, correctness, or good reasoning on its own?
It's a profound question. It definitely points towards the possibility of future AI systems becoming genuinely self-improving and perhaps more reliably aligned with what we consider quality, not just by chasing a final score blindly, but by developing these robust, potentially understandable internal thought processes. It's maybe a step towards AI that doesn't just give you an answer, but can actually explain why it's a good answer.
Definitely something to keep watching as this field continues to move so incredibly fast.